Hey guys, it's me again, back with more of my travel diaries. I heard how much you guys liked my trip to Maine, so I figured I'd share my latest travels with you. I was in Arizona, taking in a local festival, when my editor asked me if I would investigate a mesa about 3 hours away. I wasn't really on board. I'd met someone at the festival and was looking forward to spending a couple of days with them. But when I saw the advance check that he sent along, I was excited to get underway. I know, but I have bills to pay too, and festivals come and go. So I hopped in my rental car and headed for the Lost Dutchman State Park near Phoenix. The state park is pretty interesting. Lots of red rocks and cacti. Kind of reminds me of the old westerns I used to watch with my grandpa. There's a lot of buttes, and you have to be careful about critters getting into your campsite, like most places in the desert. The instructions I was given were for a particular canyon with a name that was nearly unpronounceable to me. I have to type it out phonetically when I go to write the article, but the Native Americans who lived in the area called it Watcher's Ridge. Apparently, lots of campers in the area have reported seeing strange figures up on the ridge that surrounded the valley, and it was supposed to be pretty cool, if not a little spooky. I asked some of the park rangers about it, and they told me they had never seen anything like it, but maybe it was possible. You do see weird stuff out here from time to time, one of the old park rangers told me, and you do get kids who come out here to use drugs every now and again. Not that that would change their experience. There are old places, and sometimes they're home to old things. Watch yourself out there and make sure you're being safe. I asked him if he had any advice for capturing photos of the Watchers, and I wish I had listened to what he said. My advice is that I wouldn't. Things like that don't like being looked at for too long, and they certainly don't like having their picture taken. Do yourself a favor, young man. Take some pictures of the butte, do a little camping, see your Watchers, but only write about what you see. People go missing out there, and it could always be because they decided to take more than memories home with them. I drove the car down into the canyon, and by nightfall I had a fire pit dug and my tent pitched. I walked around a little as the afternoon grew shadows, taking pictures of wildlife and the gorgeous views. It was hard not to feel intimidated by the towering buttes that surrounded my campsite, and I took a lot of pictures. As the sun set, I made my way back to my tent and started making inroads on dinner. I sat by the fire a little while later and watched the sky come to life. It was a beautiful night, the stars spreading out before me like a tapestry, and I was feeling cozy as I sat beside my fire and took it all in. Still hadn't seen any Watchers, but the reports had said they didn't come out till later. It was early spring, and the next closest fire was a little dot on the horizon. It felt like I had the park to myself, and as I sat watching the stars, I thought that if the Watchers had this kind of view every night, then it was no wonder they stayed. Speaking of Watchers, I kept an eye out for them as the night grew late, but I didn't see any. I had made sure to put myself amidst the three buttes, the best place to see one, or so the account said, and while they were quite imposing, I had yet to glimpse one of these mysterious figures. I reached for my phone and opened the email I'd gotten, looking over the accounts that my editor had sent me. There were three, one from a solo hiker, one from a couple on a camping trip, and one from a group of college students who had come out here to party. The solo hiker, who called himself Frank, talked about stopping for the night in the valley and seeing the figures on the cliffside. He'd been camping in the valley where I was now, just his sleeping bag and the stars, when he'd noticed some weird shapes on the rock wall. They were vaguely humanoid, or at least human-shaped, and had been watching him intently. He couldn't tell much about them, but they had looked like shadows that had been cast up on the rock wall. He had ignored them, and they had watched him right back. When he'd woken up the next day, they were gone. The couple had said much the same, except that when her husband had flashed his lantern at them, more had appeared on the adjoining butte. Her husband had thought it was funny then, and kept flashing the lantern at them, till the whole ledge was ringed in shadow figures. His wife had begged him to stop before it went that far, and as they sat in the canyon and watched the gathering shadows look down on them, the mood had begun to shift. Suddenly, It wasn't quite so much fun with all those ominous eyes on them, and the couple had packed up in a hurry and stayed at a Howard Johnson that night. I looked up before reading the last one, checking to see if they had come while I was doing research. No such luck, though. The third account was by far the strangest. A bunch of college kids from the University of Arizona had come out to camp for the weekend and pursue academic matters in the desert. And by that, I mean they came out to drink beer, bother people who had come for a quiet weekend, and generally be a nuisance for the Park Service. They had set up about 5 tents, 2 barbecues, and tried to set up a volleyball net before the Park Service stopped them. They had requested the space for the weekend, but they'd only lasted until the wee hours of Saturday morning. There were 4 different accounts, but they all boiled down to one story. The 12 of them had started drinking before the sun went down, and 5 or 6 of them were still drinking at about 2 in the morning. They'd built a large fire, something they probably weren't supposed to do, and were sitting around it and telling stories or anecdotes or whatever. They were 3 sheets to the wind, and that was when one of the guys had said they should tell some ghost stories. No one seemed to remember who had suggested it, but Parker was telling a story about a shadow figure who had dogged his heels one night when he went back to his dorm. One of the girls noticed the figures on the ridge about that point. The boys had started out puffing their chests and saying they better stay away from their girls or they would mess them up. But as the figures stayed up there, the group started to get curious. They claimed there were 2 at the start, but as they watched them, they noticed 2 more farther down. One of them thought they had binoculars in their pack, but as they used them to look at the assembled figures, something changed. The figures started getting angry then, their shadowy forms moving fitfully as the 4 became 8, became 16. The report claimed they had started coming down the butte, just descending like ants out of the hill, and the drunk kids had decided to put out their fire and get in their tent. All 6 had piled into the same tent, waking up the 2 people already inside, and they said that all at once it was like something was shaking and pushing the other side of the tent. They could hear people yelling from the other tents, but if anyone went outside, they never said. This went on for about 5 to 10 minutes before it stopped, as quickly as it had begun. All 12 of the kids had went to check on the campsite, and they said it looked like an army had ransacked it. Grills were trampled, coolers reduced to foam pulp, and the chairs they had been sitting in around the fire were metal and cloth hulks. The kids hadn't even bothered to clean up. They had gotten in their vehicles and left, leaving their campsite behind. They had called this report into the Forestry Service, refusing to come and clean up their campsite, and were likely on some kind of list now. They would have to choose some other national park to trash in the future, I thought, as I stifled a yawn and reached for my paperback. I looked back up at the buttes and hoped they wouldn't make me wait all night. I yawned again as I found my spot in my much-loved copy of Clash of Kings and settled in to wait. The longer I read, the more the words began to run together, and it wasn't too long before the book lay across my chest, and I was snoring beside the small fire. My head had propped up against my rucksack. The fire was low, thankfully, and nothing came up to inspect me. Nothing with sharp teeth or a rumbling belly, at least. The night went on around me, the moon sliding across the sky, and if the watchers on the butte saw me, they didn't say anything. Not yet, anyway. I slept till around 1, and when I jerked awake, I was aware of little beyond how low the fire had become and how late it had gotten. I cursed, closing my book and stuffing it back into my rucksack as I sat up and rubbed my face. It couldn't be helped, of course. I had driven all day and set up a campsite and then tried to stay up all night. Something would have to give, and I suppose my body would need to recharge at some time. I had turned to get my rucksack so I could take it back into the tent with me when I saw something on the lip of the butte behind me. It was a smudge, more like the idea of a shadow, but the longer I looked, the more I saw something hunkered up there. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in an ethereal light, and as I glanced along the butte, I became aware that I was surrounded. The ledge was full of shadowy figures, and as they goggled down at me, I reached for my camera. They hadn't liked it when someone had looked at them through the binoculars, but I needed a shot for the article. I lifted the camera, zooming in a little as I tried to get as many in frame as possible, but I had been careless. When I clicked the button, the flash went off, and in the dim light, it seemed like a miniature sun. I could see them through the little window, the zoom pretty good on my camera, and the way the kids had described them hadn't done them justice. They boiled down the side of the butte like lava from a volcano, and I grabbed my pack as I made a run for the truck. I tossed the pack in, climbing behind the wheel as I keyed the engine and peeled out of the campsite. It took me close to a mile to realize that I still had my camera in my hand, and it took everything I had not to toss it roughly into the back seat. I needed those pictures, but I needed to be alive to turn them into my editor and get paid. The moon was pretty full, as I said, and it cast the flatlands below the buttes in stark light. I could see them roll over my campsite, and as they came after my car, I continued to floor it. They were fast, but after a mile or two, I stopped seeing them. By the time I got to the lodge on the edge of the camping area, they were gone. But I still kept driving until I made it to the visitor center near the entrance to the park. I slept in the back seat with the doors locked until the sun came up. And then I went back to clean up my campsite. I was a little braver than a bunch of kids, at least when the sun was up. My campsite was destroyed. The tent was wrecked, pulled up and shoved about 20 feet from where I'd staked it. The campfire looked like a marathon had run over it. The little camp stove I'd brought was equally flattened, and I was pretty glad I'd remembered to grab my backpack. I took some pictures of the campsite, too. Might as well give the reader the full picture of what they might be encountering. I cleaned up the mess, piling it in the back of my rental car, and dumped it all into the dumpster near the ranger station. "Looks like you got more than photos," came a voice from behind me. I turned to find the ranger from the other day, his arms crossed as he leaned against the side of the bus shed that sat near the dumpster. He didn't look mad, more bemused than anything, and I couldn't help but chuckle a little as I nodded. He was right. I hadn't listened, and I had paid the price. "Yeah, guess I should have listened." He shrugged. I didn't figure you would. Some people just have to go looking for things, and they need proof to take back. Just glad you made it out in one piece." I asked him what he meant, and he glanced behind him before stepping in closer. He clearly didn't want to be heard. "I didn't lie yesterday. I've never seen anything like what you're talking about. That being said, we do find abandoned campsites from time to time. It's usually people just camping in their sleeping bags under the stars, the ones who don't have access to a tent. Even a simple door seems to keep them out, but that won't stop them from pushing it. We had a fella and his RV pushed over a few years back, and we had to get a tow truck out there to pick it up. His kids had been stargazing and must have noticed that they had an audience. We started telling people to be careful, but we haven't had a disappearance since last year, and I didn't think they would bother you. Guess I was wrong." I got a hotel not too far off to finish my article. The lodge is rustic, but it still has HBO and a whirlpool tub in the suite. The article's coming along nicely, but the memories of that night in the valley may take a little bit longer to be finished with me. Stay tuned for more of my travel articles. I'm sure I'll take you with me again sometime. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story? Or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, and Sue Casper for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, and Bella Lee for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks everyone so much. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. For just $5 a month, you get your stories 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. Also, if you'd like to join our Ghostly Reader contributor tier over on Patreon, you get a book anytime I write one on your doorstep, as long as you live in the continental U.S., of course. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.